Thank you for having me, and thank you for coming out on this snowy evening. Thanks to Brian and Brent and Christina for the invitation. I had a wonderful day out in the countryside today looking at local archaeological sites. Today I have the great pleasure of talking about the Prele site. We used to call it the Prele Mammoth site, as I have here. We've changed it to the Prele site because it's become much more than just a mammoth site. And it's been one of the most remarkable, probably the most remarkable archaeological site I've ever worked on, in that year after year it has surprised us. And I want to tell you that story today. This site has a long history. I'm going to divide this into 5 phases, beginning in 1986 and 1987, when I had no involvement. I was in middle school at the time. Nothing happened at the site for many years after that. In 2002, a master's student at the University of Wyoming questioned the significance of the site. In 2014, we returned to the site. From 2014 to 2017, we resolved the questions that had been raised about it, and the site took on new significance. From 2019 to 2022, we excavated an area that surprised us once again, that changed our understanding of the site. And the site continued to grow through our final work at the site from 2022 to 2024. And we continue to do lab work on the collections that these excavations have generated. So I'm going to walk you through this story. This is a general outline of what I'm going to talk about tonight. So where does the site sit? From a continental perspective, it sits in a pretty predictable location. What I have here is the Oregon Trail, the Euro-American Migrant Trail across the continent that took sort of a least cost pathway from east to west, and it took advantage of a gap in the Rocky Mountains. The southern Rockies here that extend up into southern Wyoming, and then there's a gap in the Continental Divide there. To the north we have the Middle Rocky Mountains, and the Oregon Trail followed this pathway, because as we know, the Rocky Mountains form this barrier, or at least present challenges to people moving east to west or west to east across the continent. And the Prele Mammoth site sits very much on this corridor. We're going to zoom in here to Wyoming. We're in the eastern part of the state, at the north end of the Laramie Range, right off the North Platte River. It's not on the North Platte River. It's about 1.6 kilometers south of the North Platte, along a creek called Prele Creek that gives the site its name. You can see in the satellite image the North Platte River to the north, and Prele Creek draining into the North Platte. Prele has its origins in the Laramie Mountains, about 25 miles. Sorry, we can do this in kilometers. Let's try it. 40 kilometers to the south. It's a perennial stream. This is a drone image of the site. You can see the creek there, and you can see that the site sits in this alluvial terrace on the left bank of the creek. It has this wonderful old railroad trestle as a backdrop. That's the old Chicago and Northwestern Railway that takes basically the same path that the Oregon Trail took. The Bozeman Trail took off to the north from near this location to Goldfields in Montana. Interstate 25 basically takes the same route. So forever this has been an area that has funneled people through it as they're moving east to west or west to east across the continent. The story of the site begins in 1986 when 2 locals were out looking for artifacts, walking along the banks of Prele Creek. William Heinrichs, who lived in Douglas, Wyoming, and his friend Mike Ernst, Mike's dad, was visiting. They went to look at some stone circles on a nearby hilltop. They were walking along this alluvial terrace here, and they found mammoth bones sticking out of the bank. This is a very common way that mammoth sites are discovered in North America. Word got back to George Frison, who was at the University of Wyoming. He was the department head, and he was also the state archaeologist at the time. Anytime we find a late Pleistocene mammoth in Wyoming, we jump on that opportunity, given the possibility that people may have interacted with that animal. And in April of 1987, Dr. Frison tested this site. And he found the midsection of a subadult Columbian mammoth that you see here. On the south side, closest to me here, we have cervical vertebra from the neck. They also had the hyoid bone. The skull was missing. They found tooth fragments on that erosional bank. As we go to the north, or the far side of the picture there, we get into thoracic vertebrae. You can see some ribs that are still in anatomical position, and I think they got into some sacral vertebrae, the sacrum as well. The animal was oriented, again, head in my direction, tail in that direction. The limbs would have been pointed out towards the creek. No limbs were found. They may have gone down the creek before anybody knew about the site. In and among these bones, they found a small artifact assemblage, about 10 flakes. Most of those came out of the cast, so they cast these bones in plaster, and then they took them out, they took them back to the lab, then you turn those over, you excavate the sediments out from the undersides of the casts, and most of the flakes came from the undersides of those casts. They found a couple of artifacts in situ, including this nice flake tool. They found a hammerstone and a couple of flakes in situ. This flake tool is made out of White River Formation chert. Dr. Frison was very excited. He was pretty convinced that this was a mammoth kill site. Associations between mammoths, mastodons, and gomphotheres are very rare. There are only about 15 known from North America. But the site sat very close to the boundary between two landowners. At the time, we didn't have GPS. Nobody was willing to pay for a survey. One landowner was cooperative, the other one was not. And that shut down excavations for 27 years. So the site sat. In the intermediate years, a graduate student named Dave Byers worked on his MA in our department. He's now a professor at Utah State. He went back and he looked at the bones, he looked at the excavation records, and he wrote this paper about the site. This was the first publication about this site. At the time, it was called the Fetterman Mammoth. It was actually first called the Heinrichs Mammoth, and it became the Fetterman Mammoth, and now we call it Prele. And Dr. Byers argued, based on the evidence that he saw, that this association between artifacts and the mammoths was actually accidental. That this mammoth had died naturally. It was partially buried by thin flood deposits. Then people used the site for reasons unrelated to the mammoth. And he made this argument on the basis of the few artifacts that were found in situ were actually found at a slightly higher elevation than the mammoth bones themselves. And he suggested there was this possibility that this association was not real. And for this reason, the site was dismissed as insignificant by some archaeologists. It was a really nice paper, it was a really nice analysis, and it gave us a really good research design when returning to the site to test if this association was real. So in 2013, I think, Dr. Frison came to me and he told me that the land had changed hands, and he asked me if I was interested in working on the site, and I said, absolutely, thank you for asking. I'd wanted to dig a mammoth my entire career. I had dreams of finding huge mammoth bones and Clovis points and all kinds of wonderful things. So in 2014, we went back to test this hypothesis, and then we didn't stop working there until 2 years ago. So it turned into much more than just a mammoth kill site. So we resolved this question of whether humans interacted with this mammoth pretty positively when we expanded Dr. Frison's excavation around the mammoth. We looked at spatial associations between the artifacts he found, between additional artifacts that we found, and mammoth bone, and found basically that they're spatially associated, very clearly spatially associated. Use wear on these artifacts plus protein residue analysis made us convinced that yes, this was a real association between humans and mammoths. Now we'll note, if you look at our excavation map here, this ring of units that we dug around the mammoth, we found about 6 decent-sized pieces of mammoth bones, but Doc Frison got the majority of the big mammoth bones. In fact, in that entire area, we found about 6 tiny flakes. So we're finding hardly anything. To be honest, it was a big disappointment. Just to give you some context on the formation of this site, it's buried 3 meters down in the 7-meter high alluvial terrace of the Prele Creek. There's only one archaeological occupation in this entire terrace. The bottom of this terrace dates to about 20,000 BP, around the last glacial maximum. Then this terrace started accumulating with coarse grain alluvium at the bottom, gravels and sands, and then you get into a series of flood deposits. So these are fine grain overbank deposits, flood deposits, each one then capped by a period of stability where we have nice soil formation that occurs. So you can see these two very well-developed floodplain soils. The occupation surface is beneath the deepest soil here. That deepest soil here, that dark layer at the bottom, dates to the Younger Dryas or the end of the last ice age. The mammoth was buried beneath that. This site has been challenging to date. We've produced a lot of dates on bone. They're incredibly variable in age, but they seem to want to plateau around an age of about 12,941 BP. This falls comfortably within the Clovis period. Clovis period, the latest dates on it are about 13,050 to 12,750 BP. That's the light gray rectangle there. The dark gray rectangle is our best estimate for the age of the site. Again, that first season we found very little, but we had one incredibly lucky find that changed our fortunes forever. We may have given up on the site if not for this one lucky find. So you can see our excavations there in the background. In the foreground is our where we're water screening. You can see it's a cool and wet morning, and we're water screening there. You can see along the terrace face, let me see if I can get a mouse. Actually, you can see there's a trail, it's marked with a pin flag there, where these are our field school students. They're carrying heavy buckets of sediment from the excavation along the face of that terrace and then down this trail. We don't want our field school students to get injured. And this is a very treacherous terrace face that we've cut this little trail into, and in one place it was very narrow. So we were cutting back into the terrace face just to widen that trail a little bit to make it a little safer. And right here, we got lucky, sort of lucky. We found this thing. Not the most beautiful artifact you've ever seen, but it's clearly out of place. Flood deposits, when a river floods and the water gets really muddy, it's transporting very fine-grained sediments, typically fine sands, silts, and clays. And what gets deposited on the floodplain are these mostly fine sands and silts. We should not have large cobbles in these deposits. When you see a large cobble like this, it's very often an indication of people. This large cobble is in the same stratigraphic position as the mammoth, and it's 12 meters south of the mammoth. It is quartzite, and you can see the end has been flaked. Here's the artifact that changed La Prele forever. Again, not beautiful. This is given the very creative name of a chopper. Again, a big quartzite cobble, 3 flakes removed, still very sharp. We sent it away to Robert Yohe for blood protein analysis, which I am very skeptical of, to be honest with you. But it tested positively for elephant, which is a pretty convenient result, suggesting this is a big, heavy-duty butchery tool. At first, this was the end of the season, of course. We didn't know what to make of it. Is this just a mammoth butchery tool that was tossed away? Or is it sort of a clue that something else is happening 12 meters south of the mammoth? And in fact, the latter was true. What this chopper turned into was a second cluster of cultural materials. In the mammoth area, in what we call Block A up there, we have maybe a total of 20 pieces of chip stone. In this area, we have more like 1,200, and the nature of the archaeology is very, very different. It looks very domestic. This is what we call a hearth-centered activity area. We have a fire pit, a fireplace, a hearth feature, and then a cluster of chip stone and bone around it. And not just that, we have this big area that is stained red with hematite. This is paint, this is pigment that was brought into the site. We have flake tools, we have bison bone, which is a surprise. We have multiple bone needles, eyed bone needles, which we did not expect to find at a mammoth kill site. And we have what we believe to be a bone bead. 12 meters south of this mammoth. The last things I expected to find at this site. This is what the ocher stain looked like. You can see the sort of pink staining in the sediment, this light pink staining. This is hematite, It doesn't occur there naturally. When we screened these sediments, the water ran pink. There was so much of it in here. We mapped something like 1,500 individual nodules of hematite. When you enhance this image with de-stretch, it really brings out the staining. You can see there's this big area that's about 2 meters by 1.5 meters where we have hematite staining and artifacts in bone throughout it. This area was truncated a bit by stream erosion, so it would have been a little bigger at the time. The hearth feature is on the far edge there, which is the southern edge. The artifact cluster continues another 2 meters beyond that. I don't know what they were doing with the hematite. This is not a unique pattern to La Prele. It's found in the Upper Paleolithic. I believe this to be a house floor, and half of this house, the floor is stained red. Our best working hypothesis is this has something to do with hide working, but we simply don't know. You can imagine if you're using paint to paint something, most of the paint is intended to go onto the thing you're painting, whatever it is, not to end up on the ground. But a lot of it did here. Clearly, ochre was an important material, whatever it was used for. Geochemically, we can source this. We know exactly where it came from. It came from the Hartville Uplift, which is to the southeast, as I've shown on the map there, about 85 kilometers to the southeast, where we have a very famous early Paleoindian site called the Powers II site. That was a Paleoindian ochre mine where this very material was being acquired. I imagine people carrying around bags of this pigment for various uses. The lithic raw materials from this area, from this part of the site, go back to the same area. Hartville cherts that you see here, these dendritic orange to brown cherts come from exactly the same area as the hematite. You can see some really nice tools here. Again, the one on the top right is from the Mammoth bone bed. The rest are from this area. You can see that there's a burned end scraper on the bottom, that little red burned and broken end scraper. We have a notch. We have various other tool forms here. Bison bone, we have a lot of impact fractured limb bones and rib fragments. This was a surprise because if you're thinking like you kill a mammoth, you have all the meat you need. Why are you using bison as well? The answer is I don't know. Why not, I guess? A lot of burned bison bone, carbonized and calcined bison bone as well. And then bone needles. These are very, very small, typically about 2 millimeters in diameter. The one on the bottom left there broke across the eye, so these are eyed bone needles. Very much a domestic space, right? We're seeing evidence of sewing here. Thanks to new technology, we know what animals these were made from. We use the method called zooarchaeology by mass spectroscopy, where you take a small piece of the needle, you extract collagen, you chemically chop it into pieces using an enzyme called trypsin, you look at its structure, and you can identify the species that it came from. I was expecting to see bison, but I was very wrong. These are made from red fox, a cat, and jackrabbit. The cat, we can say, was either a bobcat, a lynx, or a Maracinonyx. Maracinonyx is the extinct American cheetah. All of their collagen looks identical, so we can't distinguish between those possibilities given the size of it. The one in 3 pieces there is the one made out of a cat. I think it's probably a bobcat or a lynx. To us, this not only tells us that these animals were being used to make needles, but it probably tells us that there was a trapping economy, that these animals probably weren't being hunted, but they were probably being trapped. This is a new aspect of early Paleoindian lifeways that we didn't know about. If you're wondering why they're selecting these animals, our best guess is that because their bones are the right scale. If you want to optimize the production of a very, very fine bone needle, it makes sense to start with an animal whose cortical bone is about the right scale. So if you start with a bison bone, it's a lot of work to get that down to 2 millimeters. But if you start with a jackrabbit or a bobcat or a red fox, it's already there. You just need to shave down the sides to produce this. Super cool. This is what we think is a bead made out of a jackrabbit bone. I'm increasingly thinking it might be some kind of fastener. Whatever it is, it's clearly an artifact. You can see the ochre on it, but I don't know if that's intentional. There's ochre on everything from this area. But you can see the ends are very well worn. And again, zooms allowed us to identify that this was made from a foot bone of a jackrabbit. To my knowledge, this is the oldest bead from the Western Hemisphere. So because of the finding of this chopper, this exploded into this really interesting and unexpected domestic space. Our interpretation became people killed a mammoth. And as we know with recent observations of elephant hunting, when you kill an animal of this size, you don't cut it up and bring it back to your camp. It's just too big. It's much more efficient to pick up your camp and move to the animal. So that was our interpretation of what we were seeing here. Later excavations, however, showed that there was a lot more to this campsite than Block B. I will note there are one or possibly two other cases of mammoth and gomphothere kills associated with campsites. One is at Murray Springs, Arizona, where there's a campsite about 80 meters away. The other is at Fin del Mundo in Sonora, Mexico, where the campsite's about 500 meters away and not clearly associated with a gomphothere kill. We did not expect to find a campsite 12 meters away. It was a huge surprise. So we started putting in test units. This is complicated given the depth of the site at 3 meters. You can't dig down from the surface. So we put in big backhoe trenches, take it down about 2.5 meters, and then start excavating. And we started finding small numbers of artifacts basically everywhere we looked. I think only one of these excavation units was sterile. Here to the west of the mammoth, we ran into high densities of artifacts again, relatively high densities, in what we call Block C. Block C is a variation on the same theme. It's another hearth-centered activity area. It's not as rich, doesn't have any hematite, but you can see this beautiful pattern of chipstone, high densities in the center, fading out to the edges with a hearth feature in the middle. We had more bison bone, including this lumbar vertebra, but what was really striking was the lithic raw materials in this area were completely different. They don't look that different in this photo, but if you saw them in the real life, you would say, yeah, these are completely different materials. Block B has these heart-filled dendritic cherts. Block C has this brown translucent chert. It comes from a different part of the state of Wyoming. So people living right next to each other around the same mammoth are coming from different areas. Block C raw materials have moved 200 to 300 kilometers from the west, from the Green River Formation. This is following the Oregon Trail and the reverse pathway. 13,000 years before the Oregon Trail was a thing, but clearly it was a thing, and it makes sense that it would have been, because if you want to move east to west across the state, this is the least cost pathway. The Oregon Trail followed the North Platte to the Sweetwater, crossed the Continental Divide at South Pass, and it moved north from there. So these people were following exactly that same pathway. The Block C people are moving from the west, the Block B people are moving from the southeast, and they're ending up around the same dead mammoth on this creek, on a tributary of the North Platte. Again, a completely unexpected find. Based on the distribution of artifacts around this ochre stain, I had suspicions that the site kept going to the south, so we put in these narrow backhoe trenches to the south, where we could only fit half an excavation unit in there. And in one of these units, we got incredibly lucky, and we found one artifact, and only one artifact, and it was what I had been looking for 25 years. A beautiful distal end of a Clovis point made on a beautiful opaque red shirt that confirmed indeed this was a Clovis site. When you find a Clovis point like that, you want to find the rest of it, and you want to find more Clovis points, so we did the obvious thing, let's dig more down there. And we found very little. For the first 2 seasons, we dug down there, and eventually, expanding our excavations in that area, we ran into what we call Block D, which surprised us once again. This shows Block D here in the southern part of the site. Just looking at this map, you can get the sense that all of these blocks are sort of similar, but they all have their own flavor to them. The grayish blue is chipstone, the yellowish orange is bone, Let's talk about what we found in Block D. Block D is another hearth-centered activity area. There's this really interesting ring or U-shaped area of high density of lithics. It has a lot of bison bone. The big bone tends to be on the outside of the scatter. Dense concentration of ochre on the southern edge. What was striking about Block D was just the pure amount of stuff compared to the rest of the site. On the left, you can see a photo of our screens. We're using very fine 16th inch, basically window screen, and you can see all that color. Each of those are little microflakes. The densities in this area averaged 1,200 artifacts per square meter, compared to 41 in Block B, 15 in Block C, 1 artifact per square meter in Block A. The artifact densities were 20 times higher than anything we had seen. In this block alone, almost 42,000 pieces of chipstone compared to about 3,000 from everything we had excavated prior. It really implied that this was a much more intensive and long-term occupation, and that people hadn't stayed here for equal amounts of time. In Block D, more needles, including one that still has the eye preserved. That one was made from a red fox. Other needles here were made from jackrabbit. We even have a needle preform where they're making a needle here. On the right is a big chunk of mammoth ivory. We have 2 big chunks of mammoth ivory from this block that suggest things were being made out of ivory. Whatever they made out of ivory, they almost certainly took it with them. We just have the waste. This is a big chunk of mammoth ivory. We have more than 20 end scrapers. A lot of hide working was going on in this part of the site. Before this, we had 1 end scraper. This area alone produced something like 24 of these hide scraping tools. A beautiful ultra-thin biface, just incredibly well made, broken. More bison bone, including this nice mandible. You can see its location on the map there. And then yet another surprise, the site that continues, that did nothing but surprise us year after year. This projectile point, which is not a Clovis point. This is a Folsom point. In the archaeology of Western North America, forever we have said, first there was Clovis, then there was Folsom. But here we have both. I desperately tried to make this into a Clovis point. It is not. It's a Folsom point. I desperately tried to make that Clovis point into a Folsom point. It is not. It's a Clovis point. This point has been burned, fractured, and the hearth feature in 3 fragments that are all within about 2.5 meters from each other, I think. Only 10 meters away from the Clovis point, in the same stratigraphic position, and associated with mammoth ivory. We generally say first you have Clovis with a bunch of elephants, then you have Folsom with bison. Here you have Folsom with Clovis and mammoth and bison. So, you're asking me, are there multiple occupations? Maybe, but I don't think so. I should note we also have this really interesting distal Folsom piece with this square tip, which is very unusual, that I think is a preform that was broken during manufacture. It could be a finished point broken during resharpening, but another Folsom piece. So are there multiple occupations? So this is a 3D scatter plot, and I'm going to show you how these things relate spatially, okay? So here's these 3 Folsom point fragments here. Here's the Clovis point fragment. We're looking down on the excavations. Now I'm going to rotate it so you can look through it and show you that there is no evidence for multiple occupations here. All of this stuff is in the same occupation on the same stratigraphic surface within 2 to 7 centimeters of each other, vertically buried within a 7-meter terrace, where there's absolutely no evidence for multiple occupations. So, Folsom is younger than Clovis. Well, it certainly persists longer than Clovis, but this would suggest that Folsom and Clovis overlap for at least 200 years, if not longer. So, we can push that beginning of the Folsom age range down. Clovis is associated with mammoth and bison, and mastodon and gomphothere. Folsom is associated with bison, but we can add now mammoth to that list. Folsom points, the first Folsom points were created at a time when Pleistocene megafauna still walked the North American continent, at least when mammoths did. The only other thing I want to say about that is that this surface on which all this stuff occurs, we think existed for probably 10 to 20 years at most. So if there's multiple occupations, they're within a couple decades. And we say that because we have bone preserved across the entire surface. We have no evidence for soil formation from that surface. It gets buried shortly after the occupation by flood deposits. So these things are stratigraphically contemporaneous, if not absolutely contemporaneous. Okay, moving on to phase 5. We wanted to know how big this site was. We were running out of grant money and we're like, well, we don't know how big this site is. It's really difficult to find the edges of this site given the depth. As you go west, it gets deeper and deeper, up to 5 meters deep because of sediments washing off that slope to the west. So we had this crazy idea of let's dig auger holes. This is a handheld tool. You can see how deep we're augering there, drilling down holes about this big. Down to that, we go down until we got near the Clovis surface. We discard all the dirt above. We get down to near that Clovis surface. We'd start collecting in a bucket and we'd water screen. We put in this massive 5-meter grid across the site, and the site got even bigger. Okay, so every blue dot is where we pulled up chipstone out of an auger. Every yellow dot is where we pulled up bone, and every purple dot is where we pulled up ocher, and in some we got all 3. This is a big site. Keep in mind, in 2014, when we went back, I thought George Frison got all of it, and there was basically nothing left to find, and it just exploded. There's an American football field, for context. There are at least 2 areas remain buried in the site that are as big as everything we have excavated. There's a large portion of the site here in the south. The black squares we didn't even attempt because we kept hitting rocks. You hit big cobbles with an auger, you can't go down, so we just stopped. The X's were inconclusive because we ran into rocks. So those aren't negatives. The white are the negatives. And by the way, a negative with a hole this big doesn't necessarily tell you there's nothing down there in a low-density site, right? It's hard to treat a negative here as a true negative. When you get a cluster of negatives, you're maybe more confident. But consider that like these hearth-centered activity areas we find, you could fit an entire one in between our 5-meter auger block. But this area in the southwest, we don't know if the site continues there. Importantly, we did not run into another ocher stain. We did not run into Green River cherts in any of these. We think those are unique. 2022, we put in a small test there to confirm we had archaeology in the same stratigraphic context. We do. And in 2024, we put in our final excavation, what we call Block E, in this northeastern part of the site where we had 1 auger hole that produced 13 flakes, which is a lot for a very small auger hole. What the augering made us ask was, given the size of the site, how many events are we looking at? Are we looking at a single occupation, or are we looking at many different occupations that occurred across this area? Also made us question, we've always viewed this site as sort of mammoth-centered, because that's how the site was first discovered. As sort of the mammoth is the reason why this site exists. But clearly, there's a lot more to this site than just a dead mammoth. Is this the only reason, or the primary reason, why people decided to camp here 12,940 years ago? So we're still analyzing a lot of this material from Block E, which looks like this, very far north. Again, a very dense excavation area, not like Block D, but it's about 12,000 pieces of chipstone, bone, and ocher. More than 13,000 pieces of chipstone. We have a couple of bifaces, an end scraper, a projectile point tip, just the very tip that's not diagnostic. 3 more bone needle fragments. The raw materials here are different yet again. A lot of quartzite. We have oolitic cherts. The raw materials here look like they come from southern Wyoming. This is what the start of our excavation looked like there. What we do is we didn't know which way to go, so we put in this grid of units around the auger hole to see where the densities were trending, and then we put a block on top of the most productive units. And again, here's this beautiful ultra-thin biface on a very fine-grained gray quartzite, large mammal bone. We've had a lot of luck at this site, and here was another lucky thing. Probably our most recent piece of luck was that we found a refit that connects this block that's farthest from the mammoth to the mammoth that shows that these areas are contemporaneous. On the right is the flake tool that George Frison found in the mammoth bone bed in 1987. On the left is a conjoining fragment of that tool that we found in 2024, 36.8 meters to the north, showing clearly that these two areas are contemporaneous, and probably all of this stuff is. An incredibly lucky find. So over time, our understanding of this site has really evolved. In 1987, it was viewed as probably a mammoth kill site. In 2002, probably not a mammoth kill site. Certainly maybe an early Paleoindian site, but not people associated with that mammoth. By 2015, it became a kill with an associated camp. By 2016, we're asking questions like, what can we learn about the social organization of the first people in the Americas by studying multiple contemporaneous hearth-centered activity areas? I mean, think about it. I think what these hearth-centered activity areas are households. We're looking at 4 individual households of people who lived in the Americas at the end of the last ice age. And they all vary in really interesting ways in terms of density, in terms of raw material, in terms of the abundance of ocher, in terms of the type of raw material, in terms of the different technologies that we find there. There's a lot of lab work left to do. There's a lot to learn. It could potentially tell us about food sharing. It could potentially tell us about the sharing or not of lithic raw material. It could potentially tell us about group size. By 2021 and 2022, simple questions about technologies and typologies. Then, is there more to the site than just this mammoth kill and camp? Now it appears to represent a single occupation. This moment in time, this beautiful moment in time preserved at the end of the last ice age that has incredible potential to inform us about this really hard to find time period in American archaeology. I think this site is a treasure. It really preserves a remarkable and unique record of the activity of the first Americans. I mean, it's one of these rare sites that shows interaction with extinct fauna. We don't have many of those. There's multiple hearth-centered activity areas that vary in all these really interesting ways. Ultimately, as an archaeologist, that's what I'm interested in, right? It's explaining variability in the archaeological record. And this site has the most interesting kinds of variability. It gives us insight into Paleoindian social organization. I mean, one simple observation you could make is, were people moving around as cohesive bands or big groups of people, or do we have, for example, autonomous households who are doing sort of classic hunter-gatherer mobility, which is fission-fusion dynamics, coming together and breaking apart, coming together and breaking apart? Given the simple story from lithic raw materials being different in 3 of the 4 blocks in the site, it suggests that we do have that typical fission-fusion dynamics that we see in recent hunting and gathering peoples. There's one aspect of social organization we can look at. This was clearly an important place for people moving up and down the Platte River. You might ask, how do people from across the state of Wyoming end up around the same dead mammoth? Was this some sort of cooperative hunting event, or did one group bring down a mammoth and people traveling up and down that corridor later join the party? That, I think, is answerable as we do more work. We have really interesting evidence of hide working, use of pigment sewing, ornamentation. It has an incredible faunal assemblage. For a long time, there have been debates about early Paleoindian subsistence, whether it's been large mammal dominated or not. A lot of that debate has centered on the fact that, well, we don't have any campsites. Well, now we do. We have a campsite with a really well-preserved faunal assemblage. We seem to have a lot of bison in there. We have a lot of work to do to determine, though, what else do we have. We know we have jackrabbit, fox, bobcat. We're done with this site. We've excavated 220 square meters, but I promise you there are a lot of treasures still buried under that alluvial terrace, and I look forward to future archaeologists learning more. I sort of felt like we got to the point where we had our story, and even though every block was new, we'd find amazing, surprising things in every block, that our story really wasn't going to change. So it was clear that it was time for us to put this site to rest, and we have a heck of a lot of lab work to do. But year after year, the site has done nothing but surprise me. So if you have any questions for me, I'd be happy to answer them. Thank you.